In chapter 1, we are looking at interpersonal process. The first video section looked at why we communicate. Now we want to examine the communication process. Little John defines communication as using messages to generate meaning. We want to be understood. We want a sense of shared understanding and meaning. This section, the communication process, looks at explaining how messages and meanings are created in an interpersonal context and describe the many factors that are involved in this very complex process of communication. Models are a great thing because they help us examine an idea from different angles. And so we have some early models of communication. These were rather simplistic, and they were linear models. A linear model meaning it's a one-way event, something that a sender does. He or she encodes a message, takes the ideas that they have, puts it into words, encoding the message, and then delivers it to a passive receiver who on the other side will decode that message. It's somewhat akin to an archer who is the sender shooting an arrow, which is the message, at a target at the receiver. As you can quickly note that understanding of communication is rather simplistic. It seems as if the receiver is waiting passively, not doing anything, waiting for the message to be sent. And yet that's not the case in communication. Later models looked at communication more as a tennis game in which players hit balls, send messages to receivers who then respond. This feedback or response to a previous message can be both verbal or non-verbal. And this seems to be a little bit better. A transactional model looks at communication as a dynamic process in which communicators create meaning together simultaneously through interaction. So let's look at this transactional model in deeper depth. First, sending and receiving are usually simultaneous. You think of some of the things that we do if we send a snail mail letter, if we email, if we text, if we leave a voice message. Those are what we would call asynchronous. There's a delay between what is sent and when it's received. If you look at the diagram in chapter 1 in the communication process, the transactional model is clearly visually demonstrated. And you'll see not a sender and a receiver, but a communicator who sends, receives, and assigns meaning, who might be A, and another communicator who sends, receives, and assigns meaning, who's B. Notice the overlap between A and B. There's a sense of a shared background, whatever that background might be. It might be work experience, it might be relationally, it might be culturally, but there's a sense of a shared background. There's quite a bit of noise permeating the entire diagram, and we'll look at what that noise refers to. And there's a channel in terms of how the message is sent. So let's go into it and look at it a little bit more closely. Because it's often very difficult to distinguish between receiver and sender, this model replaces these roles with the term communicator. What that means is that individuals are sending and receiving multiple messages simultaneously. Meanings exist in and among people. Very often we think that we encode an idea and we send that idea, we communicate that idea, and the other person on the other side, receives the message just as we have intended. Well, we know that's not the case because very often there is miscommunication. I can't take the meaning that's in my head and put it into your head and for us to understand that concept exactly the same. Rather, meaning resides in people who express and interpret them. Think of a friend who shows up late for an event and he says to you, "I'm sorry." It might be a genuine expression, an apology. It might be an insincere statement to diffuse your anger, or it even might be a sarcastic jibe. There is a possibility of multiple interpretations, and this means very often that the two communicators must negotiate a shared meaning in order to have a satisfying relationship. Environment and noise affect communication. Some of those environmental factors is specifically the location, the physical location, but also the personal experiences and the cultural background that participants bring to a conversational interchange. We looked early on in figure 1.1 how the environments of A and B overlap and how that represents some type of commonality between the two individuals. And of course, the greater the overlap, the easier it is to communicate with the other person. Noise includes anything that interferes with the transmission, the sending, and the reception of that message itself. It can be external noise. It might be somebody speaking in the background. It might be somebody using a jackhammer in the street, or it might be loud music that someone is playing. Physiological noise involves biological difficulties like hearing loss, illness, stuttering. Psychological noise refers to cognitive factors, and that could refer to semantic noise. It could refer to the fact that you don't understand what is being said. It could be that when you woke up this morning, you had a fight with a friend, and that stays with you throughout the day. Or it might be that you're depressed and all that. So your psychological state of mind affects both the sending and receiving of messages. Channels certainly make a difference. Face-to-face interaction is what we value significantly, some more than others. Some prefer to interact online. During this COVID-19 pandemic, we've discovered, I think, how much we value face-to-face interaction. So it's face-to-face versus mediated communication. Communication is mediated via technological channels. So the choice of a channel, in some way, depends in part on the kind of message that you want to send. In a survey, respondents were asked to identify channels in which they would find best for delivering a variety of messages. Most respondents said they would, have a little trouble sending positive messages face-to-face, but that mediated channels had more appeal for sending negative messages. Interesting fact. Let's look now at some communication principles. The first one is that communication is transactional. And that is, communicators create meaning through their interaction with each other. There's mutual influence. So communication is not something we do to others, rather it's an activity that we do with them. Communication is like dancing with a partner. You must adapt and coordinate with that person. Communication can be intentional or unintentional. Some communication is clearly deliberate. What I'm saying to you right now is clearly planned and it's deliberate. But very often the non-verbal signals that we send may not be as intentional. We might yawn, and that may be interpreted as you being tired or you're bored. You may not intend to communicate that you're bored, but unintentionally you have communicated that to somebody else. People read into both your verbal and non-verbal communication, whether they are intentional or unintentional. So whatever you do, whether you speak or remain silent, you confront or avoid, show emotion or keep a poker face, you provide information to others about your thoughts and feelings. One theorist put it this way: we cannot not communicate. Communication is also irreversible. Once words have been sent, messages have been sent, and deeds are done, they cannot be retrieved. Sure, we can clarify things, clear up confusion, we can apologize for hurting someone, but once something has been said, it's done and you cannot take it back. Communication is unrepeatable, meaning that your act of communicating with somebody has changed both of you. It's impossible to recreate the same event. You've changed. By exchanging words, somehow, in some way, your relationship has changed, either for the better or for the worse. Communication also has a content dimension and a relational dimension. Let's look at the content dimension first. The content dimension involves the information that is being shared, explicitly discussed. Somebody may say to you, please pass the salt, or not now, I'm tired. The essence is on the content itself. There's not much emphasis on the relationship. All messages also have a relational dimension. That expresses how you feel about the other person, whether you like them or dislike them, whether you feel in control or subordinate to them, whether you feel comfortable with them or anxious. So the relational dimension is certainly important. Sometimes the content dimension of the message is all that matters. When you order a coffee at Starbucks, you're really not concerned about the relationship with the person behind the counter. You just want your coffee. Very often, the relational dimension of the message is more important than the content under discussion. Think of two individuals who are in a relationship who argue over very trivial things. Really, it's not about the content. It's more about arguing about the nature of the relationship, arguing about who's in control, arguing about how important one person is to the other person. The nature of interpersonal communication. So every exchange, even the most mundane, buying something at Kohl's, even the most mundane has a relational dimension. So the exchange messages have created or create or continue to shape some sort of relationship between you and the other person. Some relationships are very personal, especially those with significant others, with family members, and some relationships are very impersonal. We'll look at both. It's helpful, therefore, to look at relationships that range from on a continuum, that range from very impersonal to interpersonal. Interpersonal communication is interaction distinguished by the qualities of uniqueness, interdependence, self-disclosure, and intrinsic rewards. Let's look at those characteristics now in more detail, the characteristics of interpersonal communication. The first one is uniqueness. What we bring to the communication situation with another person is our uniqueness, who we are, our sense of self, our identity. Certainly, when we communicate, there are social rules and rituals, and they do govern how we communicate with someone else. But very often, it's the nature and history of your relationship with that person that shapes the interpersonal exchange. So think of you meeting a friend that you haven't seen for a while. It's that relationship, the history of the relationship with that person that shapes how you will greet them in the first place, whether you will hug them or not, how you communicate, whether it's warm or whether it's cold, whether it's aloof. Each relationship, therefore, is defined by its own specific custom, language, pattern, and that's a relational culture. The second feature that distinguishes interpersonal communication is interdependence. The partners are connected to each other in some way. In an impersonal relationship with a restaurant server that you don't know, you probably won't see again, you can brush off their anger, their indifference, their rudeness. But in an interpersonal relationship, the other person's life and attitude and behaviors affects you deeply. The third feature is self-disclosure. In impersonal exchanges, we reveal very little about ourselves. When you're ordering your coffee, you don't say anything about your son or your daughter, about a boyfriend or a girlfriend. You don't self-disclose. However, in interpersonal exchanges, we share important thoughts and feelings, reflecting our sense of comfort, our sense of confidence, a sense of trust with that other person. Doesn't mean that all highly interpersonal relationships are warm and caring, or that all self-disclosure is positive. Some self-disclosure is very negative, as if when somebody says, I hate it when you... The fourth feature of interpersonal communication has to do with rewards, and that is intrinsic rewards of interacting. When you communicate with someone else, you're looking at rewards, payoffs. And those payoffs are not in terms of money, but in terms of mutual influence, in terms of developing your relationship with the other person. There's some interaction that you engage in to reach goals that have little to do with developing personal relationships. So you spend time in highly interpersonal relationships, such as relationships with friends and lovers, because of the intrinsic rewards that come from it. And sometimes just being with the other person is the actual reward. The text says that relatively few of our interactions are highly interpersonal. Because they are so rare, they are very precious. Mass personal communication is an unusual and very interesting concept. When you think of interpersonal communication, it's usually very private rather than public. It's a private rather than a public exchange. However, when you post a message on a friend's social networking page, that's both personal and private, even though that message is meant for your friend, but others can view and evaluate it. You probably have those in mind as you craft the message. Otherwise, you probably would have sent an email or a private text. Mass personal communication characterizes interaction that crosses boundaries between mass and interpersonal contexts. And then finally, let's look at some communication misconceptions. First misconception is that all communication seeks understanding. Not really. Social rituals we enact every day, like how's it going? Your primary goal there is mutual acknowledgement, but it's really not for understanding. Communication is always better, not necessarily. Sometimes you go over the same things again and again and it becomes highly unproductive. One study found that co-workers who aren't highly dependent on one another perform better when they don't spend a great deal of time talking together. Very often when you're angry at someone or hurt at someone, it's better to spend some time cooling off, being away from the other person, thinking about what to say and do next. Another misconception is that communication will solve all problems, and very often that's not the case. Another misconception is that communication is a natural ability. Yeah, in some ways it is, but in some ways it's something closer to an athletic ability that you develop over time. With training and practice, you become better at it. And finally, next we'll look at the section entitled Communication Competence.